Well, we're at that time of the year when it gets dark out earlier at night, which I hate. I wish it would stay light out until 9 o'clock every night. But against my wishes, it gets dark every night. It's also chilly. I noticed some frost on the car the other day. And sometimes it looks like there's snow in the air. And oh boy, that just reminds me that this is the time of year when the best beverage to have is port wine. Hi, Joe and Mark here. Welcome to the Wine Matrix. And today, our quick fix session takes us on port wine. Although port is made in a number of countries around the world, real port, true port, traditional port comes, of course, from Portugal, not from California, not from Australia, and not from some of the other places that claim to be making port. No, real port comes from Portugal, much like real champagne comes from the Champagne region of France and not other places in the world. Port is a fortified wine. Let's talk about that for just a minute. When we make still wine, we crush the grapes, we allow a fermentation to take place, and the yeast consumes the sugar until the sugar is all gone, and we now have a dry still wine. Usually alcohol level is somewhere around 14 or so percent, but generally not much higher than 15 and a half. And yet we have a dry wine. But port's a little different. Port, we have a high alcohol wine as well as having a wine that is fairly high in sugar as well. So if the yeast is consuming the sugar and making a dry wine under normal conditions, how do we have sugar and how do we have high alcohol? Let's discuss that for a second. So port is made very much like you would make a dry still wine. Crush the grapes, start a fermentation with yeast and sugar, and all of the sugar is consumed. However, with port, what we're going to do is we're going to start that fermentation with the yeast and the sugar, and then we're going to add some neutral grape spirits or some grape brandy, if you will, into that fermentation. Now, the grape brandy is high in alcohol, so yeast usually dies somewhere around 19%. So if we put the grape brandy, that high alcohol level grape brandy, into that still wine while the fermentation is going on, the alcohol will kill the yeast and thereby allowing the sugar to continue to survive. Now we have a beverage that is both high in alcohol and also has the sugar because of the yeast dying off because of the alcohol burning it up. We've got port wine. Port actually comes in two distinct different styles. We have our ruby ports and we have our tawny ports. Our ruby ports are bottle aged, meaning after we make the port, that port goes into the bottle, gets placed in the cellar if it's going to be a aged port, and is allowed to age in the bottle for a period of time until we decide to release it. Our tawny ports, on the other side, are port wine that's going to go into barrels. Therefore, it's going to pick up a brownish color, and it's going to age in barrels rather than age in the bottle. If we go back to our ruby family of ports, we find that the entry level, the starter port, the most inexpensive port on the ruby side, is going to be a basic ruby port, and it will say so on the bottle. These ports are great primarily for cooking. From there, as we get to the more expensive ports on the ruby side, the bottle side, we might go into a vintage character, of which port houses like Juarez might have their Warrior. Port houses like Graham's might have their 6 grapes. These are ruby ports that have a better quality level than the baseline. As we go further up the pyramid into the more expensive ports, the better tasting ports, the more complex ports, we will enter the LBVs, or the late bottled vintage ports. These are ports that actually have a vintage date stamped on them, meaning that the port has come from that particular year. However, they're late bottled vintage ports, and they assume the characteristics of vintage ports only with their characteristic of quality, their characteristic of flavor, the complexity, kind of sped up a little bit. When we look at the top category in Ruby side of the family, we're looking at vintage ports. And vintage ports are ports from a specific year that are put away in the bottle and aged for a period of time until the winemaker feels that they are ready to go to the market. Our vintage ports are the most expensive. Our vintage ports are the most complex. Our vintage ports are the longest age and longest living ports that we can find on the Ruby side of the family. When we move to the other side of the family, the Tawny side, those ports that are being aged in cask, we generally find that the cheapest, most inexpensive, everyday port, again used for cooking, would be a simple base Tawny port. As we move up the pyramid in the Tawny side of the family, our ports take on an age characteristic. We'll find 10-year aged Tawny ports, 20-year aged Tawny ports, 30-year aged Tawny ports, and 40-year aged Tawny ports. And obviously, the higher up we go in the age statement, the more expensive the port is going to become, and generally the rarer it's going to become because of its complexity and because of its less of it was made over the period of time, or less of it, I should say, exists over the period of time. Now, there are also some very rare ports on the Tawny side of the family known as single colheita ports or single vintage ports. These are ports from a single vintage that have been put in cask to age for a long period of time. And we can find single vintage or single colheita ports on the Tawny side of the family that are just absolutely extraordinary. The older the single colheita, the rarer, the more expensive it's going to be. And of course, you're going to want to sip on these ports in a very small amount because they just have so much to offer. Ports go well with dessert. They go well after a dinner. If you've had a great bit to eat and you're a little bloated and a little tired out, a glass of port works wonders for the digestive system. Port is also a wonderful dessert in itself. Because of its sweetness, because of its high level of alcohol, it goes fabulously well with blue-aged cheeses, particularly Stilton, particularly Gorgonzola, maybe some Maytag Danish Blue. And don't leave out the nuts. Almonds, pecans, and walnuts are fabulous in that combination. And if you're a little daring, try some Gorgonzola in poached pears with your port. Yum, yum, yum. They certainly take the chill off of a winter evening. Now, let's not leave out white ports. There are also white ports that are made. Generally, they're used as a cocktail. It's not uncommon to go to Portugal and find a white port in a cocktail with some fruit added, a little bit of club soda. They are delicious in the summertime. And of course, if you dig deep, if you look hard, you might be able to find some aged white ports, which have a tendency to be incredibly complex and expensive at the same time. So we hope you've learned a little bit something about port. Port is great to have this time of year. We hope you've understood the difference between the Ruby side of the family and the Tawny side of the family. Get yourself some port. Start out, my suggestion, with a base bottle of Ruby and a base bottle of Tawny. You can find each of those for under $20 a piece. Try them each. Find out if you like the Ruby side or the Tawny side of the family. And from there, you can move up the ladder until you find those ports that A, you can afford, and B, you find you can't live without. Thanks for tuning into the Wine Matrix. Thanks for tuning into our quick fix on port. We'll hope to see you on our next session.
Thanks for watching the Wine Matrix. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.